Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for this third and final webinar in the series of 3 webinars designed to assist service providers with getting active in the Shaken ecosystem. We will begin in 1 minute. Okay, I'm Brent Struthers, Director of the Secure Telephone Identity Governance Authority, otherwise known as the STI-GA. Before we get started, I would like to cover a few ground rules. So during the discussion, I'll encourage you to submit any questions you may have using the question feature on the webinar controls. We'll hold the questions till the end of all the presentations. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Again, if you want to submit a question, type it into the questions box and just hit enter. In addition, both the slides and a link to the recording of this webinar, like all the others, will be distributed by email to all of the registered participants. So you don't have to be here today. You can look at it afterward if you'd like. With all the ground rules out of the way, let's get on to the real subject of today's webinar. That is, once a service provider has registered with the STI Policy Administrator and has its certificate from an STI Certification Authority, what comes next? I'll be moderating today. We also have 4 panelists, all of whom are leaders in the work of the STI-GA. I'll introduce them as we progress throughout the webinar. But before we get started with the panelists, I want to give a quick update. So Sarah, if you could go to the second and third slide, we'll give you a quick update on the progress of the STI-GA, and then we'll get to the panelists. So go to slide 3, please. Okay, so we have, as of today, 115 service providers registered, authorized by the STI-PA. So that is a good and growing number. There's another 20 or so service providers that are approved, meaning they've gotten through the testing staging process and they've just got to sign some paperwork to get going. And then there's a whole lot more providers that are kind of in a pending state that are at some point in the registration process. So bottom line is the number of service providers that are registered and authorized is really growing. In terms of certification authorities that are approved not by the STI-PA but by the STI-GA board, there's now 7. The board wanted to make sure at the outset of the Shaken framework that the service providers had a good number of certification authorities to choose from. Once they were authorized by the STI-PA, they could get their certificate, the certificate they use to sign their calls. So now you've got 7 different certification authorities to choose from. That's a good number, and we may yet have more, but right now we're pretty comfortable with the 7 we've got. In terms of policy change request, you know that the STI-GA board sets the policy for the Shaken ecosystem. That doesn't mean that policy is set in stone. The board will take input from outside parties on that policy. A couple of examples of input that the board's considering right now. We've got an input that has asked the board to support the optional service provider use of delegate certificates in the Shaken ecosystem. So the board's looking at that. We've also got an input about the potential for REST boards to gain access to SBC tokens so that entities that want to originate calls from toll-free numbers could have A-level attestation for those calls. The board is taking a look at that as well. Outreach and education, you're involved in one of those webinar events today. I really put this up there to let you know that if you missed the first 2, you can still gain access to those. We've recorded those. We're recording these slides. You'll see a link to that later. the STI-GA website. If you're not familiar with that, you should get familiar with it. There's a lot of resources up there, including the links to these webinars. So if you're not familiar with the STI-GA website, there's your link. Go there and check it out. Now, I want to move on to the technical committee. So let's go to the next slide, Sarah. The technical committee is the committee that advises the STI-GA board on all things technical. And as this is stir shaken, it's a very technical subject. So for example, on delegate certificates, they talk to the board about how delegate certificates work. If there's security or issues with that delegate certificates might create in the shaken ecosystem, they'll advise the board of that. The two leaders of the STI-GA technical committee are, and let's go to the next slide, I'll show you their pictures, are Martin Dolly. Martin Dolly is the technical committee chair, and he's also lead member of AT&T's technical staff. If you've been at all involved in the stir shaken standards process, or any standards process for that matter, for a long time, you probably know and heard of Martin Dolly. Chris Wen is pretty much the same. He's the technical committee vice chair, director of IP comms and RTC solutions for Comcast, and just like Martin, been heavily involved in lots of standards work, and very heavily involved in all the stir shaken stuff. So Martin, Chris, you want to join us? Wait until they turn on their cameras and their microphones. There's Chris, there's Martin. Wonderful, thank you. Martin, I think the first thing we wanted to do is talk about the attestation level. So when a carrier gets their STI certificate and they want to sign calls, what are they signing? What do the attestation levels mean? So Sarah, if you can go to the next slide, I think Martin will talk us through that.
Okay, so in the beginning, we talked about attestation levels. Okay, and so there's full attestation. Okay, and you ask yourself, what is it you know, and why do you think you know it? Well, full attestation, in its purest sense, is this is your customer. You've assigned them the telephone number that they're using, so they are allowed to use that number, and so you verified it with their customer account. The use of that number. Then there's partial attestation, and here's an example where it's your customer, but you didn't assign a telephone number. And the classic example of this would be for enterprise, where a Fidelity will get numbers from AT&T and Verizon. And even though they typically only send the AT&T numbers to AT on our SIP trunks, we can receive a Verizon number. And so in the purest sense, this is the B attestation. This could also apply for different wholesale reseller arrangements as well. And then the last one is gateway attestation. Okay, and so this is where you're receiving your traffic on a gateway, whether it be a wholesale gateway where you have your customer is the wholesale provider, but where the call originated from, you have no business relationship, or an international gateway. Okay, and we're starting to see within the ecosystem, different countries like Canada's very active, and pretty soon the UK will be ramping up. Now, with that said, we ran real quick in the beginning to meet the FCC needs, knowing that we had to come back and address corner cases, okay? Because we very quickly found out that everybody wants that A attestation, okay? And so, there were several techniques that were created in order to vet customers that may have gotten a B in the purest sense, elevating them to A attestation. Those include, TN registry, centralized database, delegated certs, and letter of authority. And so that's pretty much it on the attestation, Brett.
Okay, thank you, Martin. I appreciate it. Interesting. You'll see a freeze frame of me as my camera's freezing up, but that'll work, I guess. We also have the technical committee. The STI-GA technical committee has worked on some best practices for service providers. So, Chris, I think you want to talk about the best practices, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some different best practices that were set out by the FCC. So, Sarah, if you could go to the next slide, we'll talk about the best practices from the TC.
Yeah, thanks, Brent. At least froze. Oh, now it disappeared, so we're good. But at least it froze on a nice picture of you. Now we got you going. Yeah, so we have, it's a pretty short list actually of technical committee best practices, or service provider best practices. I think that it actually is. Oh no, it actually addresses CA too. So I'll just go through them. Really, the basis for these best practices are to make sure we maintain the security of the ecosystem. It's mostly about following the specs, making sure that you're doing the right things to validate the certificates and signatures that you're getting through the network. So the first one has to do exactly with that. So in Stir Shaken, we have the ability, just like in any PKI, the ability to revoke certificates, and that could happen for a number of reasons, and we have some guidelines on that. But primarily, it's about, if the credentials get compromised in any way, we want to make sure that we notify the rest of the ecosystem that happens, or if there's other reasons for revoking service providers' certificate, or ability to create new certificates, that's also the mechanism. So the advice is to make sure on a timely basis that you should check the certificate revocation lists, and we recommend on a daily basis. It's updated on a daily basis, and so just to make sure your list is complete. Also, as Brent said, we may have new participants that come in from a certificate authority point of view. So, while we don't anticipate that list to change too often, you do want to make sure that you're also checking that on a daily basis to make sure if you received any calls that involve a new CA that you're up to date and you're not failing any verifications related to new CAs that join the ecosystem. The next one involves making sure that CAs and SPs make sure that they do follow this. So one of the main outputs of the STI-PA is the SPC token, the JSON Web Token that contains essentially the validation that you are indeed as a service provider, an authorized service provider. So we obviously want to make sure that people follow those credentials, check them, follow all the standards to do that, and follow the CRL associated with the web tokens to make sure that the JSON Web Tokens themselves are actually valid. So obviously just follow all the standards there. And then the last one is periodically, as Brent also mentioned, we may need to update the specifications and the policies associated with the STI-GA and the STI-PA. We don't anticipate that happening on a very regular basis, but it will and can happen. And we encourage service providers to stay up to date with the latest changes in those policies, certificate policies, and then API changes. Like I said, we're going to try to keep that at a minimum, but we may need to respond as an ecosystem in case there's new things that come up or or new features and functionality that the industry would like to add. The next slide, Sarah. I'm going to briefly touch on this one. There's a set of FCC best practices, which was actually based on the CATA working group. It was actually the second CATA working group. Interestingly enough, the first CATA working group was the one that defined this body, the STI-GA and the STI-GA TC. But the second one focused on, and this is a summary of the conclusions of that group, and then what were endorsed by the FCC as a result of that working group. And it has all to do with best practices on how you make sure that when you're giving a attestation, when you're assigning calls, you need to follow the following types of things. And it addresses vetting of the business entity, TN number validation, third-party validation, international is one that Martin brought up as a very important one. And then just generally ongoing robocall mitigation practices that we believed were best practices. So I'll hand it back to you, Brent.
All right, so I've got myself from a black box to a freeze frame again. So at least you can kind of see me. I'm not sure if that's helpful. I've got some questions for both you gentlemen. First about the attestation levels. In terms of A-level attestation, a service provider can use local policy to determine a customer's right to use a telephone number. What does that mean? What does local policy mean? And can you provide an example of local policy?
Okay, so one example of local policy would be a service provider, for instance, for one of our business services, the app server maintains a list of AT&T numbers used by the customer, and they also have a list of TNs from other providers, as well as vanity numbers like AYY. Okay. There's under the know your customer. You could, based on the business relationship, trust that customer. So, for instance, an AT&T and a Fidelity, as an example, Brent.
Thank you, Mark. Chris, you want to elaborate on that, or?
No, I think that covers it. We local policy can generally is associated with the service provider and its local vetting and validation. We've extended that with a few things that Martin mentioned. You mentioned the database. We also have this delegate certificates mechanism that allows very indirect cases where there isn't direct communications with the originating service provider to provide other mechanisms, but all of those sort of boil down to like eventually at the end of the day, the OSP is putting their reputation on the line in terms of attestation, so they want to be very sure, and that's what local policy is all about.
Are there any guidelines or standards that help a service provider determine local policy, or is it just them, if they don't do it right, they're putting their reputation on the line?
Okay, so yeah, basically it's going back to knowing your customer, and so the standards, like I said, include the TN registry, centralized database, delegated certs, letter, the letter of intent, all of them which include vetting. Probably the two places where there are not guidelines is how the CVTs do their data analytics. And though in the beginning, even before the FCC strike force, IPN and I was working display and, you know, that green check mark and picture of Mr. Shockey has been around probably since, you know, 2015. And, but there's no set standards for display. But with respect to knowing your customer, you know, there is. And I think even with that, I mean, as Chris pointed out, with the FCC practices, they all complement, you know, the work done in IPN&I.
Thank you. And since you talked about display, let's just throw another term out there. You talk about CVT, that means call validation treatment. That's the analytics providers. But there's another term that gets thrown around sometimes, something called Verstat. What's Verstat, and how does that relate to stir shaking?
Okay, so all right, so when we looked at the architecture, okay, so a carrier in their network, okay, could have the verification function, for instance, at the edge of their network, and the, you know, the interface or the task that would be in some implementation deployments, the interface to the call validation, you know, that you need to relay the attestation level. And so the Verstat, after the verification, there are certain values it would Verstat as in, you know, number verified, number not verified, number verified but failed. And then the idea was to send this, and it's defined in 24229, registered with IANA, send that to the UE, resulting in the green check mark. Somewhere in the time frame of the strike force, you know, we started to learn about these analytic engines that do statistical analysis, and all the carriers use that. And so, you know, there was discussion on expanding Verstat values. One example of something being discussed recently in IPN&I would be for emergency calls, whether it be government priority services or for, you know, 911 callback, etc. And so there is a mechanism for us to get new values contributing into 24229 in 3GPP that will then take care of the IANA registration. The topic of expanding the Verstat values comes up periodically, but we haven't updated them since the original contributions went into 3GPP back in the fall of 2016.
Okay, thank you. Now, let's say I'm a service provider. I want to make sure my calls get that green check mark. Is there any way to guarantee that I'm going to get a green check mark? Do all providers, you know, provide that positive notification on calls? Okay, so, and again, here's where it's really going to be, you know, local policy. Okay, so for, you know, within, you know, for instance, our network, there are certain devices that get positive notification, okay? But in all cases, with at least our deployment, the everything passes through the data analytics, and that, you know, the Verstat may be passed to a device, resulting in a green check mark, but only after it goes to the data analytics, because they're based on their statistical data. They may
a number that may pass the stir shake and verification may still be bad. And so we would rely on the CVT or the data analytics for generating any negative warnings. And that for a positive indication, that could either come in the call setup signaling, but again, going through the CVT first, or go directly via the application directly from the CVT to the device.
Okay, thank you. Chris, you wanna elaborate on that at all, or not?
Yeah, and I'll also respond to one of the questions as well. Just sort of asking, you know, that the difference between giving a green check mark, spam identification, and actually blocking traffic. So to be clear, none of the policies say that you should block traffic or can block traffic based on stir shaken. So that part's clear. But I think to expand on what Martin said, the rules were meant to be tailored to local policy, quite simply because you take a piece of information of whether the telephone number is true or not, and then look at analytics to try to determine what the intent of the call is, and how you display that to the user, you know, is really sort of more of a customer experience thing that probably needs to be tailored over time and figured out how we best serve our customers to show them the right information for making decisions on whether to pick up the call. So there's been a lot of discussions. We have some documents that provide some good opinions, but at the end of the day, we want to make sure it's flexible enough to make sure that we're providing the right customer experience.
And the flexibility is important here, right? We're still at the beginning of this whole stir shaken ecosystem. Right. We're figuring out how things work and what customers like and don't like. So, you know, we need some flexibility as we move forward.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Also too, Brent, I mean, we things were referred to local policy because we also knew that as we put capabilities into the network, the robocall scammers are pretty smart people too, and they would adapt to their techniques. And by relying on certain decisions on the carrier local policy and not fully defining it in the standard, leaving that flexibility allows the carriers to change over time as the methods and patterns of the robocaller will change over time.
Thank you. And I think I'm going to give up on my video since it's either black box or nothing. So we're going to go with the nothing. I'm going to thank you guys. I'm going to bring you back at the end because I've got some more questions for you, but I don't want to go too far before we start talking to my other two panelists. So if you guys could turn your mics and cameras off, I'm going to start introducing the other two panelists, please. Sarah, yep, the STI-GA board. So you've got a hint as to where we're going. I've got two panelists from the STI-GA board, and they are our leaders of our STI-GA board. The first one is Linda Vanderloop, and she's the STI-GA board chair. She's an assistant VP with External Affairs Regulatory for AT&T. And Glenn Klepper. Glenn is the STI-GA board vice chair. He's a director of regulatory for Charter Communications, but his role today is representing the NCTA, who he represents on the STI-GA board. So Linda, Glenn, welcome. Appreciate you joining us today. Before we get into questions, which is mostly what we're going to do with Linda and Glenn, we're going to go back and forth and ask them questions. I think both wanted to have some introductory remarks on a couple of topics that are important to them. So could you, well, take it away, Linda. And Sarah, if you want to go to the next slide, that'd be great.
Thank you, Brent. Can you hear me? Did I unmute?
You're just fine, and we can see you too.
All right, so just a few opening remarks, talking about the STI-GA. Just to the STI-GA is actually made up of all three: the industry board, the technical committee, and the administrator, who is right now is ATIS. That role is filled by ATIS. And focusing a little bit on the board represents all service provider segments that are required to implement STIR/SHAKEN. And I can't talk about the board without first mentioning the dedication and commitment of every board member to work cooperatively to make this ecosystem inclusive and secure. And the 12 board members, I don't know of any issue in the history of, well, at least since I've been working in telecommunications a long time, I don't know any issue that any two of us would totally agree, and some of us have been on opposite ends of the issue, on every issue. And this group of 12 board members has committed to work together and collaborate, and there is not one issue that we have not been able, or every issue we've been able to come to consensus where we came up with a solution that everybody could live with. Maybe the preference would have been something different, but it was something that we worked together. And I really think that we've made a lot better decisions because of all the diverse input. So the CATA working group established the STI-GA board, the first CATA working group. I know Chris referred to both of them. And established the framework and some very aggressive timelines. And the STI-GA met every single timeline. And I'll turn it over to Glenn now to talk a little bit about some of the accomplishments the board has made, or the STI-GA has made.
Sure, thank you, Linda. Yeah, just to expand on that a little bit, starting with some of the milestone dates that were provided or set in the initial CATA working group in 2018 was the establishment of the GA board, which took place, as we just mentioned, in rapid time. Also, the issuance of an RFP for the policy administrator. And in 2019, some of our milestones were our PA vendor selection, our contract negotiation, and the go live of the policy administrator in 2019. In 2020, we continued and created a number of policies for the GA, including the revocation and reinstatement policies. And one of our bigger milestones, I think, is reflected in 2021, as we have well over 100 service providers now authorized in the PA.
All right, sorry about that. More technical difficulties on this one. So I want to go to, Sarah, if you can go to the next slide. I think we're just going to go into questions and pick Glenn and Linda's brain about a number of issues. All right, first question. From the perspective of the industry, will service providers, do you think service providers will be using anything like a green check mark? I know Martin and Chris talked about that a bit, to notify the called party of the legitimacy of a call.
I'll touch on that, Linda, just for a second, Brent. Yeah, without getting too technical, and as Martin and Chris already explained, that there's not a defined ATIS display standard, and it's going to vary by service provider, by their capabilities. Let's say if they're mobile or wireline. Linda, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think it's really important. We did a lot of consumer research, and we found that the most important thing for consumers is that they receive information to decide whether to answer the call. Green check mark is very helpful. However, not all devices can support a green check mark. So for some of our devices, we use the green check mark. For some, we'll use a V for verified, but it's very important that the consumer communication is very important so that they understand what the green check mark actually means, what the V actually means, and that it continues to evolve. And Chris mentioned that, you know, as time goes by, as the scam, and Martin mentioned, the scammers change, the consumer preference may change too. So it's very important to continually assess what works, what doesn't work. Is more education needed. So there's no standardization, and I suspect there never will be.
All right, I think that's enough of the green check mark, but thank you. I think we've covered, it's an important topic, and I get a lot of questions on it. One of the other topics that Martin and Chris hit on a little bit, or Chris hit on a little bit, was call blocking. Should providers block calls solely on the basis of a shaken validation?
Brent, service providers should follow the FCC's rules when performing call blocking, and that expands beyond shaken and stir. An example I was thinking of is that a spoof number may result in a B-level attestation and still be a legitimate call. So back again to, yeah, they really should follow the FCC's rules when performing blocking. Linda, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And the industry, I think I haven't heard anybody who has come out and said, I'm going to block if it doesn't have an A attestation. I think we have consistently said that until stir shaken is fully implemented, the blocking should not be based on the attestation alone. And there's question about whether even when it is fully implemented, and when I say fully, I mean there's a solution for non-IP, that everybody's implemented it, that everybody's exchanging. But even then, we need the analytics to determine whether or not to block the call.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. Well, let's talk about if I'm a service provider and I've signed up with the STI-PA. I've gotten my certificate from an approved STI-CA, one of the 7 we had on the list earlier. How do I ensure that other providers will accept calls that will accept calls that I have a stir shaken header on, an authenticated header? How do I make sure other providers will take those calls?
Brent, I think service providers, they may contact other providers to discuss interoperability prior to sending signed traffic. And I think they can check the PA website and verify that the service providers they are signing are also authorized. That's 2 things that come to mind to me when I think about that. Linda?
So if you're talking about accepting calls, nothing's changed. I mean, we have a process where we interconnect with all the other providers, and we exchange. We accept calls, and we either pass them on the call chain or terminate the calls or whatever. As Glenn was talking, the stir shaken information is once we receive the stir shaken information and we have that IP interconnection and can successfully exchange that information, we will pass it along the call path as we received it. I think the one exception might be with a delegated cert. If an originating carrier receives a delegated cert, they may prefer to use a TN registry, as both Chris and Martin were talking about. So in that case, the attestation level would be, the attestation level will always be determined by the originating provider.
Okay, wonderful. In what instances might a shaken header, a call attestation be dropped during a call transit from provider A all the way to the end to the terminating provider? Why might a shaken header be dropped?
I mean, there may be a lot of technical reasons for that, and so you might want to bring Chris and Martin back on the technical aspects. But as far as our intent, once we can successfully exchange the stir-shaken information, is not to drop any information. Now, for the technical aspects, there could be some technical issues.
For example, if a call goes from SIP to TDM back to SIP, the TDM is not going to carry, the header won't carry through on the TDM, correct?
Oh, of course, yeah. I thought you meant why. Yeah, it was, yes, of course.
Okay. All right. So let's get into another.
The call path has to be end-to-end IP, and there has to be the interconnection established between the providers in the call path. If that's not the case, then the information could be dropped.
Okay. Thank you. I want to get into a different subject, a little bit about revocation. So once the service provider joins the ecosystem, they've got their certificate, they're signing calls. One of the GA policies that Glenn talked about was the revocation policy. You could stand to have your SBC token that you got from the policy administrator revoked. Why might your SBC token be revoked? I.e., how can a provider make sure they're not getting their SBC token revoked? They're doing the right stuff. So why might something be revoked?
Brent, I think just as it's detailed in the revocation policy, I think one of the three main things are not adhering to the SBC token access policy, and that's a policy that's under our GA website. Also, part of that goes to not adhering to funding requirements, and overall not adhering to the shake and stir standard. Aside from that, I think there's some more administrative type of examples where you're like, let's just say if your credentials were compromised, or if you close out your account, then yeah, your token will be revoked. But the other three are I think the ones that we more commonly think of as far as revocation. Lynn, what do you think?
So when talking about revocation, it's very important to understand that nobody on the board wants to revoke a token. So the process is, we want to work with every service provider when there's a cause for concern, and so we want to make sure that we have a totally iterative process to work with the service providers before revoking the token, and so there'll be a lot of conversation there.
So let's talk about that. So if I'm a provider and somebody's accused me, or I've misused my certificate, I've set the wrong attestation levels or something like that, and I'm subject to having my SBC token revoked. Will I find out about that? Do I get a chance to talk to the STI-GA board before they revoke the token? How does all that kind of work?
So yeah, once the issues have been brought to our attention, to the board, we will reach out to the service provider and explain what the situation is, give them the opportunity to provide additional data. It would be a very collaborative process in the investigation, hopefully a collaborative process, because we really want to work with providers. We don't want to revoke a token. We want every service provider to continue to provide service. On the other hand, we don't want scammers to be using our network. So we have the revocation process in place and hope we never have to use it.
Yeah, I would just add it's definitely a multi-step process. It doesn't go from step one straight to revocation in a snap. It's a multi-step process.
Yeah, a service provider will know when the token is revoked. They'll know why, and there could be a lot of reasons why. I don't know if I'm bleeding into some of the other questions, Brent, but I think I'll just talk about this for a minute. You know, we will identify why the token was revoked. Sometimes it could be just because the service provider didn't understand the process and what needed to be done. So then there'll be the opportunity, once a token is revoked, they can immediately turn around and submit a plan to get for reinstatement. So they'll take a look at, okay, this is what was deficient. This is how I'm going to correct the deficiencies, and then turn around and apply for reinstatement. Anything to add there, Glenn?
No, I think you covered that one.
Yep, that's called the reinstatement process, and I think you said this, Linda. I mean, immediately upon getting a SBC token revoked, the company can seek to remedy that by going through the reinstatement process, correct?
Correct, yeah. The board has a general appeal process, but it could be a lengthy process, and we recognize that we need a more expedited process for a token that's been revoked, because once the token's revoked, then the service provider is not going to be able to, likely is not going to be able to provide service to the customers. And so we wanted to make sure that this was a much more expedited process. So there's no waiting period. If a service provider can fix the problem in a day, if they can fix the problem as we're going through the investigation, that's even better, because then we wouldn't have to revoke the token at all.
Right.
Wonderful, thanks. One more question, and I think we're going to open it up for a few audience questions. At this point, do we know if the FCC will play any kind of a role in the STI-GA board's revocation process or appeals process? What do we know about that at this point?
Linda, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, the FCC has a FNPRM pending to decide what role they should play in the revocation process in the appeal, and so that is the comment cycle is comments are due on March 19th. Yeah, March 19th, and reply comments are due
April 19th.
1 month later.
Yep.
April 19th.
Right. So if you're a service provider and you want to make sure the FCC has some type of role in there, you can file your comments with the FCC, expressing that with them. So we're all just kind of watching the FCC at this point to find out what kind of role they think they're going to have. Okay, let's bring Martin and Chris back, because I have a question for them, and then we'll go through a few questions on the. There they are. Okay, everybody's here but me. That's good. While we're on the subject of revocation, Martin, Chris, what happens to a company once their SBC token is revoked? What's the consequences of that?
I can take that. Basically, once the token revocation is essentially when you try to retrieve a new, fresh SBC token through the STI-GA API, it will fail, and then you won't be able to use that with your STI-GA in order to get new certificates. So it's essentially that SBC token, as I mentioned before, is the key essentially to validate your good standing within the STI ecosystem.
Okay. Thank you. In terms of good standing, I want to remain in good standing. Linda, Glenn, anybody, do you guys have some, well, not necessarily best practices, but advice to service providers as to what they can do to keep their token from being revoked?
I would start by, I mean, my first suggestion is to read and familiarize yourself with the revocation policy, which is posted for users to see.
Anyone else? Okay.
And the other thing I guess I would add in addition is if know that you're responsible for whatever attestation level is given to the call, and be as accurate as possible. Have processes in place to make sure, maybe even review, have a way to audit and check your attestations and make sure that they definitely are accurate. And that would include any delegate certs that you provide or accept.
Right. And I think that goes back to the local policy. If you're setting your local policy correctly, if you're vetting your customers correctly, you're knowing you're attesting at the right levels, as opposed to just somebody who might want to give every single call that comes through them A-level attestation. You're setting the attestation levels correctly. So,
yeah,
okay.
I think generally it sort of boils down to intention, right? If it's a technical mistake that happened in your network or something that you couldn't avoid, obviously that's not intentional. But if you're aiding a known spammer to get attestation A, that's obviously a different scenario. So I think there's a spectrum in between those that just, I think we follow common sense for the most part.
Yeah, and I think though, I mean, this is where the value's added, with the analytic engines. Because, irregardless of the attestation level, you could have an A that, because of the statistics, could show up as spam, potential fraud, depending on the user's profile in the CVT, could result in blocking there, but again, with customer consent. You could end up with a B attestation getting a green check mark based on the statistics as well. And again, all that's based on local policy. It's not written in stone, and it was designed that way to allow for flexibility as we grow in our deployments.
And this question from the audience kind of takes off on that same subject, so I'll just read the question. If based on the company policy, the call to validation treatments, the analytics providers determines that a phone number should not be deemed as valid, i.e. get a green check mark, even though Shaken gave it an A-level attestation, is there an effort to provide feedback to the STI-PA to identify any potential abuse there?
So let me start on that one. The situation where a green check mark or an A attestation might not get a green check mark is generally where it's a scammer who has maybe a block of numbers and is not spoofing a number, because the A attestation means the call is not spoofed. So if a scammer gets a block of numbers and starts scamming people, then the analytics company is going to suppress the green check mark, because consumers, as I was talking before, we've got to make sure that there's no customer confusion. And if we had green check mark and scam likely, or scammer, or fraud, that's kind of what the situation. So the PA would really have, the PA is doing their job, and the whole ecosystem is working if the call is not spoofed and it's got given an A attestation. Now, there's other things, there's other tools that we all should probably be using to make sure that those scammers aren't originating calls on our network, but that's outside the scope of the STI-GA process.
And I think, Linda, you just answered this question indirectly when you talked about the purpose of STIR-Shaken being detecting caller ID spoofing. The question is, what is the expectation for STIR-Shaken to actually accomplish, if not to block robocalls? Anybody want to take that?
I'll take that, Brent. Okay, so I mean, going back, even, to 2016 when the strike force, and even a couple years before that, the famous, Shockey view graph, there's no silver bullet. And it's almost like, cybersecurity. There's not one line of defense that's used for protecting your network against cyber attacks. Similarly, when it comes to robocalling, there's not one capability or solution by itself that will combat this, but rather taking a layered approach, stir shaken, with the analytics, with the traceback, with do not originate, so on and so forth. Using those tools together will, hopefully provide a successful outcome in mitigating robocalling.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, stir shaken is specifically about putting truth back into the telephone network. That doesn't mean that there's not going to be bad actors still out there, even though they might have the right telephone identity. So I think that's exactly the right approach. The hope is that, once you keep people honest on the network, that we will have less problems as a result. But we obviously don't want to, only rely on that, and we should use other tools to determine what the outcome is.
Yeah, I think, the most egregious robocall or illegal robocalling, my understanding, it involves spoofing. So I think that was kind of like the logical starting point for this, kind of like Martin and Chris said.
Thank you. Yeah, I like the way you said it there, Chris. I think instead of saying this is a stir shaken effort, where I'm going to say this is an effort to bring truth to the network. I like that.
Yeah.
Good ring. There's an interesting question just came up. For outbound dial companies that legally and ethically spoof calls, there is legal spoofing. Can they ever get an A-level attestation?
Yes. Yeah, there's in the industry is working on several tools for that. One tool is the delegated cert, where the originating provider, the service provider, will delegate, and I think Chris or Martin can talk a little bit more about that if you want the detail, but can delegate the certificate, and so you can give your own calls the A attestation. Or there's a TN registry that's being developed where a enterprise can input all of their numbers. So in particular, the outbound dial companies can input all their numbers into the database. And so the originating provider will dip into the database and know that you're authorized to use the number, even if that service provider, the originating service provider, did not allocate that number to you.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this is a case for call centers, and 8XX numbers are used for this, and when they're used in outbound dialing scenarios, it's spoofed every day and often. So we wanted these mechanisms that can support this indirect case, specifically because we knew that there's so many of these cases, and they're actually quite valued calls on the telephone network. But it's a tough problem, and but I think if you take a look at some of the guidelines in the latest CATA report, that might help as well to put the story around those things.
Okay, I've got about 15 seconds left. If anybody's got any last word?
Word.
Thank you, Martin. That's the last word. One last word. Well, thank you. I want to thank everybody for attending the STI-GA webinar series. I want to thank all my panelists, the bringers of truth today, for joining us and sharing their wisdom with us. All registered attendees will receive a follow-up email after this webinar containing the links to a recording and the slides from this presentation. And then again, for information on the STI-GA webinar series or all other things STI-GA, there's the website link for you. So again, thank you for joining us today. We thank everybody for all their questions, and y'all have a terrific rest of day.
Thank you.